Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy.
It's really interesting that you bring up the avascular tissues, because that's something I've experienced discussing in the community that I serve, since I work primarily with gender diverse clients and many of them are on testosterone for the purpose of medical transition. And through the grapevine, some of them have heard that they can't lift too heavy when they go on TRT because of the risk of tendon injury or ligament strain. And my understanding and what I've seen in my practice with my clients is that as long as we respect their anatomy and their ability to load those tissues with proper form, they can work within the 5 to 20, 30 rep range that I utilize for hypertrophy. And they're able to do that without injury, and they can also push to very high intensities of effort all the way to failure safely. And I have never had a client who reported a tendon strain or a tendon injury or ligament strain while also being on testosterone. So far, fingers crossed, but I haven't encountered this issue with the practices that I apply in my coaching practice.
I absolutely love that. And I tend to find the same thing as with my clientele is that for those individuals who, let's say, are a little less technically correct with their form, it is more so the coach's responsibility to intervene and to challenge them to be like, hey, like you can build muscle this way, but it's going to get to the point where you injure yourself if you keep lifting this way. And it's not even necessarily, to me, an issue that they're lifting at that intensity. It's they're lifting at that intensity simultaneously, losing, I guess, like um, failing to adhere and uphold that technical quality that we're striving for that ultimately is protecting them. But I think especially when we look at, the fitness community and we look at these like open bodybuilders, these classic physique, men's physique competitors, I mean, like a lot of the injuries that they're incurring, I think if I had to theorize, is due to very poor training practices in addition to training in a way that exposes them to risk of injury, which I've torn my serratus during a state of contest prep. It's a pretty significant injury. I was enhanced at the time, but again, like I wouldn't necessarily look back and be like, well, the enhancements themselves or the anabolics themselves exposed me to that risk of injury. Anything at the time, I was actually on a SERM, so a selective estrogen receptor modulator, something to lower estrogen. And I do think because of that, in combination with being in a state where my estrogen was already super low and I was under recovered, I think that played a much more significant role in that injury occurring.
That makes sense. And I'm glad we're busting that myth. I will say, when somebody is in the initial stages of taking testosterone to transition, what I found is that they might incur an increase, especially if their levels happen to get within the physiological male range pretty much right away. Or if by accident they go above that, then they seem to incur a much increased rate of muscular gain in the first few months, as one could predict. And in that case, that's when you are at the greatest risk for injury, not because of this avascular tissues risk that's inherent to anabolics, but because you get excited to be on testosterone, you get excited to have this increased energy, this increased recovery capacity, you feel really strong, and from a gender euphoria perspective, you feel like you're living authentically at last. And I feel like that tends to lower inhibitions if somebody isn't being followed by a coach who would know what might occur. And in that case, especially without any coach at all, you might find yourself getting injured. But it's not because the testosterone caused the problem, but because yes, your muscles were growing at a faster rate than before, and also you let go of proper form, because there's a difference between lifting really intensely at really heavy loads, but maintaining control over the weight the entire time, and essentially looking like a dancing monkey just for the sake of moving a weight from A to B. The two are going to have a very different degree of injury risk.
I completely agree. And I think it's an important specification to clarify, regardless of goal. I think the compound in itself is not the culprit, even though it can and oftentimes is correlated and associated as the catalyst of that injury.
That makes perfect sense. So, from a training perspective, if somebody is enhanced, they might be able to train more, to train a little bit harder, to recover faster from the training. What about from a nutrition perspective and from a body composition perspective? What is it like to go through a bulk or through a cut or to simply maintain your body weight? What kind of changes can you see when you're enhanced as opposed to natural?
So I think it's important to clarify the use of TRT, and I'll speak from my perspective here, is restoring normal to normal high levels, so at a very modest dose. You're not going to see the inflation that you would see using a compound like Anavar. I've used Anavar multiple times. I've used it in a contest prep setting, so there wasn't a lot of body fat to mask those superficial changes. But I would say when we look at something like Anavar, the times I've used it, the times clients have used it, and I could theorize that it is the dosing that makes such a impactful difference in the visual changes. But this is one that I will see overnight. Those changes occur. Like I will see a significant increase on the scale weight. So there will be about a 2 to 5 pound increase within the first week of use. I will say that in the times I've used it, I have been in a deficit. So there is no way, no rhyme or reason to suggest that I had built muscle during those phases, even with the anabolic. And then upon pulling out the anabolic, you tend to see those deflation, that deflation begin to occur, which is something that I think psychologically can be very difficult and very hard on individuals. And I guess I would like to follow up with this. Do you see within your community, do you see Anavar being used to expedite transitions?
Not in my particular side of the community, where I'm talking about clients who are typically quite risk averse. They're also not really, they don't have bodybuilding ambitions. They want to lose body fat to improve their health. They want to build muscle to shape a more gender affirming physique. So, in particular, if they are, for example, trans men, they might want to masculinize their body through training, to look the way that they envision for themselves. Whereas if they're trans women, they might want to look more feminine through training. So they wouldn't take any compounds beyond what was prescribed by their doctor for the purpose of transition.
Mm, okay, gotcha. That makes sense. So I guess, to really depict more of those compositional changes that I see within my scope. Um, I think for a lot of male bodybuilders or individuals who are looking to compete in the male divisions, they very much will see these massive swings in body composition, specifically muscularity to body fat. So that P ratio when they're on cycle versus off cycle, even still having testosterone in place, they're still seeing their composition shift pretty dramatically, which having worked with a handful of them, but also having relationships with different, top competitors can be very psychologically demanding. I know for myself, I mean, even just the fluctuation of being in a very lean physique, having a body fat, a degree of visibility of the muscle, and then losing that or letting it go, I guess is probably the more appropriate term. That, can certainly weigh on you. But where I see the use of anabolics and specifically PEDs come in is to satisfy that desire to hold on to and sustain that peaked physique, which I think is just such a big misuse of performance enhancing drugs.
Yes, it sounds like they almost become dependent on PEDs in order to always get that high from seeing their physique undergo that dramatic change. And once they stop taking PEDs, that effect goes away, and it sounds like psychologically they can't cope with it.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think this has been a really big reason that within the content that I put out and the principles that I teach and encourage individuals to follow or at least understand is making sure that you're able to build progress sustainably, and that if you do desire to have more muscle, that you're doing so in a way that isn't reliant on these anabolics. I mean, within those constraints of like you're not going to be able to have this in indefinitely, like it's not TRT, it's not HRT, so eventually pulling this out is probably going to not be fun. And I mean, I'm very open, like Anavar, I wish that was a pre-workout. Like, I mean, it feels great, it's going to make your workouts feel better, but they're pretty significant risk that make it to where that decision making process, the framework around whether or not I would use it just to simply feel a little bit better, feel a little more confident, it just doesn't align with the risk that I consider too impactful.
That makes sense. And I think a question that I probably should have asked an hour ago, because it sounds pretty basic now that I think of it, but it got lost with all the questions I wanted to ask you, is can you explain? So, just to spell it out for the audience, with it sounds like with TRT as a base, you would take that continuously, potentially in the long term. Whereas you've mentioned going on cycles and off cycles. You've made references to PEDs not being utilized forever every single day. Could you explain a little bit about how a cycle works?
No, I love that. And I think that'll hopefully fill in this gap for listeners is that TRT or testosterone used in this manner is specifically designed to give you baseline coverage. So you wouldn't necessarily cycle off of that. There wouldn't be testosterone cycles that you have in place unless we're talking across like a very, very large horizon in the essence of like, well, now I'm 65 and I have risk of potential cardiovascular events. And now I'm going to remove it because it is skewing my lipids significantly to the point where it could be problematic. Unless we're talking about that kind of horizon, we would realistically leave it in place, assuming that there's nothing that indicates that it is problematic. When we look at I would say this is really that segment of anabolics that I would consider more performance enhancing and more ancillary. You really wouldn't be putting those in unless absolutely needed. And in terms of female cycles, I do for risk averse females who are not looking for any kind of utilization. There is a threshold in which I would say really past the point of 6 to 8 weeks, and I have to question like, okay, has this done what we were hoping it to do? Like, have we built the muscle? And that's really like I probably should have started with this is like, why do we put these things in place for individuals who are not looking to transition? We put them in place to build muscle. That's the primary goal. That's the thing that they're really good at. So making sure that prior to their inclusion that we're being really cognizant about the progress that we're getting. Are we already seeing muscle come on to the athlete's frame? Because if we're not, sure, you can put it in place and you're going to see that immediate inflation. You're going to see the scale go up. You're going to see that you get stronger and maybe you'll build a little bit of muscle. But for someone who's risk averse, I think it's important to have all of your boxes checked and be in a position where you can really guarantee, like, hey, like I'm going to skip ahead from 4 to 6 months progress here in the next 6 to 8 weeks. Now, for male competitors, male fitness enthusiasts who don't have that same consideration around virilization. They're okay with a little bit more of that, let's say, conversion to DHT. They're okay with that androgenicity. Um, I would say that the cycle duration is really going to come down to need, and this is going to be very phase dependent. So, for the individual that is looking to get on stage, I mean, that's probably the easiest one for me to outline. There is going to be a period in that prep, so in that dietary phase where we do use anabolics to enhance the physique. In the off season, though, in the time in which you're not in a deficit, that's really the point in which you can take advantage of it.
Dear listeners, I'm going to interrupt this interview just to make a quick note. You're about to hear Cory pose a question to me in relation to PED usage for a client who is transitioning. Now, if you followed me for long enough, and as I stated earlier in this interview, I don't work with clients who take PEDs. So please do not take my answer as an answer that I would give in a professional context. Think of it as an opinion that I expressed based on everything that I had learned through Cory up to that point, as well as in my own personal research. In other words, take it with a grain of salt because I have no problem stating that I do not have the required knowledge and experience to help anyone, whether they're transitioning or not, with their PD usage. And I am sure that all of you already know this, and I probably didn't even need to record this note, but I have been thinking about it the whole time since that conversation, and I almost wish I hadn't answered with the confidence that I expressed in the interview, because it did make me think in post-production that such confidence could lead somebody to believe that this was a professional answer from me when it was really only an opinion based on relatively little knowledge in the grand scheme of things. So it didn't feel right to me to put out this content without this disclaimer. So if you didn't need to know and you're thinking, dude, it was so obvious, you already said that you don't work with people who are on PEDs, why are you recording this? Then thank you for listening to this extra 30 seconds. But if it was helpful, then I am also glad that I added this in. And now back to the podcast.
Thinking this process out for an individual who's transitioning, if they were looking to, I guess, expedite that process, would you say that maybe the inclusion of an ancillary anabolic, assuming it worked out with their timeline of what they were hoping to achieve, um, if that were to be included, that in my mind would make more sense to have that in when they're not in a fat loss phase, when they're not dieting or trying to essentially recomp, when they can be very intentional with the muscle building process. Would you agree?
I think, bearing in mind that the main reason for including PEDs and especially AAS within a protocol would be primarily to build muscle, then yes, I would agree with that, because if that's you want to, I think that you want to include those compounds when you can make the most of them. And if you are in a deficit, you can't exactly make the most of your muscle building potential. So considering the risks involved, it would make sense to me to take those risks when you can also get the greatest rewards.
100%. And also doing so in a way that, if you're going to be doing multiple cycles, or there's going to be multiple periods where you're trying to propel your progress in that direction, being very intentional with health markers, both prior to the inclusion of the anabolics. So, I mean, like monitoring for blood pressure, being very cognizant of sodium intake, of your cholesterol, of specific lipid panels. So, having a good understanding of going into this cycle, even if it is, let's say, going to be 8 to 12 weeks, in that case, okay, what are the potential risks? And do you have the lab work, or at least an understanding of how to go about monitoring and assessing whether or not there was any damage that now needs correction post cycle?
That makes perfect sense. You've been super generous with your knowledge, Corey, and I know that you have about another 10 minutes or so to go. So I was hoping to wrap up the podcast with a little bit of myth busting, which I think is always fun. So I am going to give you some suggestions of facts that, well, or rather notions that could be facts or could be myths, and then you can tell me which one it is. Does that make sense?
Perfect. I love it.
So the first notion is that using performance enhancing drugs is always cheating under all circumstances. Fact or myth?
I think it's a myth. I do think even in tested organizations, I think like Olympic weightlifting specifically, or any weightlifting, you're going to see a high degree of drug use. And I mean, frankly, it just comes down to having the right team behind you, teaching you how to get away with using drugs without getting caught. So I am not, I don't know, I'm not a big fan of like demonizing PED use within the constraints of bodybuilding. I mean, there are organizations that are tested, but even within that, I do see a lot of PED use. I've had many individuals come to me ask for assistance in circumventing these parameters. So I don't know. I don't have as much of a problem with it, but I'll be honest, when I first got into bodybuilding, I was a very proud natty. I kind of wore that as like, I mean, I had a big chip on my shoulder about it because I thought everyone was taking drugs. And little did I know they were really going to start taking drugs 10 years from then. Yeah, myth.
I would agree. For one, for the listeners who may not know, in bodybuilding, there are, as you call them, tested organizations where they actually test for whether you are natural or enhanced. There are also untested organizations where they don't test for that. So it's literally not cheating because there are no rules against being enhanced. But also, throughout this conversation, it's become apparent to me that you're not enhanced or natural. There is a spectrum from one end of the spectrum, of the natural spectrum, to the other because of the variety of compounds and the variety of doses that one can take. So it sounds really limiting to me to discuss this from the perspective of cheating or not cheating when even the difference between enhanced and natural is a matter of shades of gray rather than black or white. And I also don't like the demonization or stigmatization of PED use because it discourages honesty and open discussion about them, and that puts more people at risk of inadequate use.
I love that. And what's interesting is we're seeing right now a very unique shift in the PED space within bodybuilding because you now have the prevalence of GLP-1s that are literally designed to make you tolerate very low calorie diets and in some ways even reprogram the signaling that you associate with highly palatable foods. Within my scope, I mean, I see a lot of this use even within the competitor space. And it's interesting because once, at one point, you had natural athletes demonizing enhanced athletes in a very black and white sense. Now you have PED users, enhanced athletes, demonizing GLP-1 users, saying that they're cheating, which is just a very perplexing, ironic situation, considering the whole sport is, I mean, quite literally, it is a dieting contest.
A comment of yours that brings up another interesting observation, which is that cheating is also a subjective term because for some people, taking creatine monohydrate is cheating. And creatine monohydrate, for those who don't know, is a perfectly legal substance that I've been taking since 2019. Whereas for other people, taking maybe Anavar would be cheating, but being on TRT would be perfectly acceptable. So I also believe that we can't really make such sweeping statements such as UPD's usage is always cheating for that reason.
100%. Yeah, I think there's a lot more that goes into it. And quite frankly, the amount of women that I know who are on TRT who claim natural, and I want to believe they believe they're natural because they aren't using Anavar or they aren't using clenbuterol or growth hormone. Yet it's like we do have actual natural athletes who endogenously their testosterone supersedes, into the 80, 90, 100 nanogram per deciliter. And we see this and it's like, well, would we start a witch hunt and be like, show us your labs? Because even endogenous production, we're cutting it off at, 99 nanograms per deciliter. It's very interesting.
All right, I think we've covered that in enough depth. Now, second notion, only bodybuilders and athletes cheating in the Olympics use steroids in the fitness community, and certainly not your favorite influencers. Fact or myth?
Oh, no, the influencers, they use steroids too. Men and women, female influencers, male influencers. I really under the umbrella of a lot of influencers, uh, their living, their livelihood is based on their physique. And I try to take a very similar attitude towards this. Is like it's not my place to judge if this is ethical, if this isn't ethical. I will say the individuals who have built a business specifically around them being a natural athlete, yet are not honest about that, who are very much enhanced. I do think that's very unethical. And I think that, for the individual who is, hoping that they can attain that same physique naturally, I mean, I found myself in that position for a long time where I had very unrealistic and very naive expectations in terms of what could be done. But I would, as a listener, I would just be very aware that it's very easy, in the States at least, to get your hands on compounds, both anabolics and non-anabolics. So um, I would try to read between the lines and see if someone is very forthcoming, with their status, but also respect the fact that like it's their business. I do think on some level, a lot of the like top Olympians, girls that I am friends with, I understand a reluctancy, a hesitation in disclosing that status, and I think they kind of have the right to also keep that private, with a heavy asterisk on unless they're monetizing their natural status and they're not actually natural.
I would agree with that, Corey. And you might be aware of this paper, but I wanted to mention it so that the audience can get a little bit more perspective on this. There was a survey that was published in 2024, so just last year, and it was titled Exploring the Prevalence of Anabolic Steroid Use Among Men and Women Resistance Training Practitioners After the COVID-19 Pandemic. And they surveyed a total of 3,603 men and women resistance training practitioners. That's what the authors call them. So a large sample size. And 53.05% of men and 41.99% of women used anabolic and androgenic steroids. So that's
Yeah.
essentially, if you're in a gym and you've got 100 members, more 53 of those, if they're all men, are taking anabolics, and 42 of them, if they were all women, are taking anabolics. So this is to say, I am not in a place where I intend on judging anyone, but as you say, Corey, I do take issue with a lack of straightforwardness about usage, because while it is relatively prevalent, it's also clear to me when I talk to general population people that they are not aware of their prevalence. They don't even know how to recognize that somebody is using, but by looking at someone's physique. And sometimes it's legitimately hard to tell because the degree of response you get depends on dosage, but also on your own genetics and muscular potential. So I completely appreciate why they wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And I think that it's quite damaging. As you said, when you started your own journey, you had very unrealistic expectations. And for some people, the discouragement and disheartening reality of their own muscular potential without anabolic steroids, if they don't know that that's what's being used, can actually deter them from persisting with their fitness journey, which is going to affect their long term, not only the physique, but their entire health and well being, because of how important it is to train and eat well for the sake of your health rather than in addition to your appearance.
I couldn't agree more. And I think, one thing I want to add to that is unfortunately, there are so many enhanced users that physically, just based off their physique, you wouldn't assume that they're enhanced. You see a lot of men and women who their bodies do not represent their exposure. And I mean that from an anabolism standpoint, but also an androgenic standpoint. And it's a caveat that I do encourage individuals to consider, when they're I mean, gosh, just to be frank, like within my demographic, there is a lot of judgment about women who have virilized who didn't intend to virilize. And it's a shame because it's like, well, that in itself isn't necessarily going to make them want to be forthcoming around it. And I think even to bring this back to that initial point that like there are a lot of physiques that don't tell the full story, and just because someone hasn't virilized doesn't mean they necessarily have used PEDs correctly, and just because someone has doesn't necessarily mean that they were abusing PEDs. So I think really the message we're both trying to, which I really appreciate, by the way, you're doing amazing. You're very well versed on all of this content, which is very refreshing. I think the message we're trying to drive home is like assumptions like are oftentimes misplaced. Yes, be informed and be guarded and be understanding, but really try to make the best decision that aligns with your goals. And I think being extremely clear about what's important to you around femininity or a lack thereof, I think that is paramount.
Absolutely agreed. I'm wondering if you have time for one more or if we should just wrap up.
Oh, no, no, that's perfect. Let's do the next. Yeah, let's do,
Awesome.
yeah.
Because my last one can open up another can of worms, but it's too interesting not to give it to you. And it is this notion: if you want to start lifting, jump on PEDs right away so that you can get the best results immediately.
I
Fact or
mean,
myth?
myth, myth. If you go on the internet, that is what you'll be told, though. If you open any social media platform, um, I have made tremendous gains this past year, 2024, with just TRT. In being I wouldn't consider myself natural, but being quasi natural, being natty adjacent, like whatever you want to categorize it. I too had a belief that I needed anabolics, ancillary anabolics, in order to facilitate significant changes. Um, but looking back, I can, firmly say that the thing that was holding me back from the progress that I wanted, which was more muscularity, was I wasn't able to commit to not being super lean. I've always struggled getting lean. So when you achieve something like that for the first time, um, getting to those body fat percentages, I think it can be very difficult to let go. And I think this is something that paired insight with the body dysmorphia that can come with pursuing very, advanced elite goals or goals over a long horizon. You can really overlook the importance of training principles. My boyfriend, he is a expert in biomechanics and functional anatomy, and this year working with him, delegating my training to him specifically, I was able to do more, add quality inches to my glutes, to my delts, with what I would consider a very modest drug exposure, and very reasonable body fat accumulation, which I think is most people's biggest fear when they're considering, whether or not they should go about a build naturally or somewhat naturally, or even just without assistance.
That's very interesting. So what I hear you say is learn the basics of lifting and eating appropriately to your goal first. And then once you have run those protocols, we've run those basics for long enough to really understand them, really make the most of them, then consider whether drug use is appropriate for you or not still.
Yes, amazing and very well articulated. I think for listeners, if they can hone in on that, is making the most of what you're able to without drugs. If you do cross that threshold and decide to become assisted, you can get a lot more out of them, which I know that feeds more into the ego, but it's still like that's why a lot of people are even considering taking anabolics.
That makes perfect sense. And I think with that, we concluded the myth busting section of the podcast. And Cory, I want to thank you once again for coming on. And before we sign off, I want to ask you how people can connect with you if they so wish. And I'll leave all the links in the show notes.
Nikias, thank you so much for having me on. This has been so enjoyable. I hope listeners have had some actionable takeaways. All of my content is at Cory_fit, so CORY_FIT. I have my own podcast, the Self-Selecting Podcast, on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast. I also offer Patreon, where I have several tiers, the third including 4 bonus episodes, as well as just a slew of content in and related to performance enhancements, as well as health markers and interventions. So thank you so much for doing this. This is great.
I agree. I love this conversation. Thank you, Cory. And thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in. As usual, I hope you learned something valuable today. And I look forward to talking to you again in the next episode.
Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.